Welcome everyone to Inside Academia, the weekly program where we take a look behind the ivory curtain, seeking a frank discussion behind American higher education. I'm your host, Andy Nash, and my guest today is David French. After graduating with honors from Harvard Law School and practicing law since 1994, he's a past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education and remains a member of their legal network. He has authored several books on religious liberty and currently serves as senior counsel with the Alliance Defense Fund since 2006, which is a legal alliance of Christian attorneys and like-minded organizations defending the right of people to freely practice their faith. He runs the ADF Center for Academic Freedom. David French, welcome to Inside Academia.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Recently, there was, according to the media page of your website, there was a huge controversy at UC Davis, where they apparently had a policy on their books defining religious/spiritual discrimination as, quote-unquote, the loss of power and privilege to those who do not practice the dominant culture's religion. Further adding that in the United States, this is institutionalized oppression toward those who are not Christian. So basically, to define religious discrimination as Christians oppressing non-Christians, almost as if to exclusively define it as just that. ADF weighs in on this. Can you give us a little bit more background about this case?
Well, it's an interesting case. It's emblematic of a lot of what's wrong in higher education. They were requiring students and student groups to reaffirm commitment to their, what they call their principles of community. Mm-hmm. And one of the principles of community was commitment against religious discrimination, which, sounds fine. But then you read the definition of religious discrimination. It was literally what you just read. In other words, discrimination was discrimination by Christians against others. So, if, for example, a Muslim professor didn't want to hear from a Christian and ordered them out of the classroom, that wouldn't be religious discrimination. If an atheist professor decided he wanted to grade down Christian students, that wouldn't be religious discrimination. It's emblematic of the way the academy has singled out Christianity for negative treatment, singled out Christian students and Christian professors often for discrimination and persecution. Our case files are incredibly long and often incredibly discouraging. Mm-hmm. And, just as a kind of logical point, if Christianity is such a dominant religion, why did we let that non-discrimination policy pass?
Right.
That's not the action of a dominant religion. The dominant worldview in our public universities is secular, and it's on the left.
Mm-hmm. There were many other cases at other universities. For example, there was a pro-life student organization, and this was at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario. This is in Canada. The law is a little bit different up there, but members of the group had been arrested. They were blocked from freely expressing their pro-life message. They were handcuffed, and they were arrested, and they were taken away. So I imagine as an attorney with the Alliance Defense Fund, you represent students such as these in lawsuits, but you also spend a significant amount of time writing letters to universities simply to reword and recraft their policies.
Well, that's exactly right.
How much of your work and the work of the Alliance Defense Fund would you say is proactive in simply getting universities to simply reword or recraft the policy, as opposed to retroactive, in which somebody's rights in some way were transgressed and you had to then go and represent them in a suit?
Well, I think most of the time we can take care of things with a letter. For example, in the situation at UC Davis, we were able to write a letter to the university, and they changed course within a matter of hours, which was incredibly encouraging because the policy was unconstitutional. But I have seen universities defend unconstitutional policies in court for years. So we're really encouraged by that. We had a situation at Vanderbilt University where they were requiring students to acknowledge that they would perform abortions, actually assist in abortion procedures themselves, so that we were able to resolve that situation by letter within 24 hours. So often by letter you can accomplish a lot, but the situation in the university and at Carleton University in Canada shows sometimes you have to go to court. And in that situation we actually have a Canadian attorney who is an allied attorney to the Alliance Defense Fund who's representing those students. And we have multiple cases going in the United States where we have not been able to resolve things by letter, where students have gone ahead and expelled. Universities have gone ahead and expelled students, where they've denied promotions to professors, and we've had to step in and go to court and sometimes spend years in court.
Hey, there was a similar case in Florida A&M where a student group had been barred or expelled, but then they were eventually reinstated after your organization wrote a letter to the school. Could you explain a little bit about that as well?
Well, that was a very interesting case because I'd never seen anything like it before, actually. You have to hand it to universities. They can find creative ways to censor their students. They told this student group that the only way that they could meet on campus is if they had a faculty advisor or a student group advisor present with them at the meeting. And now this advisor would be chosen not by the student group but by the school. And then the student group would be able to meet only when the advisor wanted to meet, whenever that was. So if the advisor was busy, if the advisor didn't want to meet, or if the advisor didn't like the subject of the meeting, they would just have to not show up, and the group couldn't hold a meeting. It's unusual, to say the least, to say that you're not going to let a private organization meet on campus unless a government official is present. So once again, unfortunately, we wrote a letter, and the university that time, within about 72 hours, allowed the student group back on campus, and now we're trying to make sure that that policy gets changed.
Right.
But critically, they've allowed the group back on campus.
Now, you, as we mentioned in the introduction, you were at one time president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and you're still currently working as part of their legal network. They typically go after all sorts of cases in colleges and universities where First Amendment rights, students' free speech rights, and such are constantly being violated, not just along religious lines, but against political lines and so on. For the Foundation of Individual Rights in Education, you wrote a small book back about, I guess, 2002, called The Fire's Guide to Religious Liberty on Campus. And as part of that, you explained the difference between public universities and private universities and described how the law applies to each one versus the other, right, with respect to religious rights and First Amendment rights and so on and so forth. Can you give us a little bit of background of that? Because from what I read in there, you explained very succinctly that the Constitution essentially protects individual freedoms from government interference, and thereby public universities, as agents of the state, then have to abide by those same restrictions. But private institutions, private universities, have significantly greater leeway in what they can do, but to some degree they are limited as well. Could you explain how exactly are private schools freer to discriminate against someone on the basis of religion than, say, a public institution?
Oh, sure. It's really pretty simple. A public university is part of the government. The Constitution restricts the power of the government versus the citizen. A private university is, in its own way, is a citizen itself. It has its own freedoms. It has its own liberties. So, for example, a religious school can form and organize and decide it's going to be dedicated to advancing a religious point of view, including codes of conduct for students, religious requirements for professors, and it has the right to do that. There, the rights that a student have versus their college are much more defined by the agreement with the college itself. That the student handbooks, for example, that say how free speech is on campus, or student handbooks that provide for due process, like a hearing before there can be discipline. So what happens on private campuses, though, is that universities, and particularly administrators in some academic departments, they want to have it both ways. They want to be known as the home of academic inquiry, but then they also want to make sure that the students are getting one uniform message and hearing one uniform message about controversial ideas. So you'll see a student handbook promise free speech, and then a student punished for engaging in free speech. And essentially, what FIRE has long done, and what we often do at the Alliance Defense Fund, is just say to a private university, you can be whoever you want to be. You can define yourself however you want to define yourself, but live up to your agreements.
Okay, so it's not a case, can you correct me if I'm wrong, so when you challenge a private university for violating a student's rights, it's based on false advertising, not on the basis that they necessarily broke a constitutionally protected law.
Right. It's usually on a breach of contract. In other words, that they have a contract with their student. The student is paying tens of thousands over the course of their entire 4 years, often well over $100,000 to even $200,000 to the university. The university is promising them certain rights. The university promises them often academic freedom. It promises them the ability to disagree, to debate. But then when it doesn't deliver on that promise, there can be a breach of contract claim.
So is the argument then that as long as they're not contradicting themselves as far as what they put out to you as their mission up front and center, as long as they follow that consistently, they can violate your rights all day long because it's your choice to go to that school, or you can just choose to not attend that school.
Well, I'll give you a great example. I went to a private Christian college. When I walked in the door, I had to sign agreement with the code of conduct and sign agreement with the statement and basis of faith of that college. So I knew what I was getting into. It wasn't as if I went to that college and then I woke up one morning and, holy cow, I have to go to Bible class? What's going on here? No, I knew what I was getting into. So that is the right of the private school. If you want to have a Bob Jones that's a religiously conservative school, you can have that. If you want to have a Bob Jones of the left that is extremely secular, dedicated to a secular point of view, you can have that. But what you cannot do is say, you have free speech, and then deny it. I'll give you a great example, and this is a case from several years ago that Fire pursued. A student in a teaching education program wrote a paper in which he said that corporal punishment should be permitted in schools. Now, it's permitted in about half the states and not permitted in the other half. Well, the school just threw him out, just completely threw him out of the educational program. It was a private school. Could they do that? Well, it turns out that they had a contractual agreement with him that before they did any kind of discipline, they'd give him a hearing, they'd give him an impartial finder of fact, they do all of these processes that they didn't do. Yeah. And so a New York state court said, no, you can't throw him out until you give him the exact processes you promised him. So it's real simple. At a private school, they just have to keep their promise.
Okay. So now you mentioned also Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity and several other similar characteristics, even for a private institution, if that private program or activity is receiving federal funds. Right. Virtually every university or educational institution of higher education, even if they're private, is in some way, shape, or form getting some kind of federal assistance or some kind of public money. So does that mean that they are also subject to some these First Amendment laws in which they're not allowed to violate someone's rights, or as long as they're consistent with how they violate your rights in terms of their policies, is it still okay?
No, just getting money from the state doesn't make you subject to the Constitution. It makes you subject to the actual conditions placed on the money. So, for example, Title VI says, if you're going to get federal money, you can't discriminate on the basis of race. So any institution of higher education that discriminates on the basis of race can't get any federal money. I don't know of any institutions of higher ed that discriminate on the basis of race, but if there were, they couldn't get federal money. But a lot of people have a misconception that just because a university takes federal funding, which can be something as simple as a soldier who comes back from Iraq using their GI Bill there, that's a form of federal funding. They're not then subject to the Constitution. They still remain private. They're still a private organization. The only conditions they have are those strings that are specifically attached to federal money. Okay. A great example of that is rights of conscience for healthcare workers. A medical school that gets HHS, Health and Human Services funding, can't discriminate against students who are not willing to perform abortions. And that's a condition attached to that money.
Does your organization specifically go after violations of religious freedom again that are occurring against Christians, or does it also represent non-Christians, or is there just a dearth of anti-discrimination against non-Christians in universities?
We've represented non-Christians as well. And I don't want to. It's not simply that all of our cases involve religious liberty. I would say a vast majority of our cases involve really what are pure free speech issues, not distinctly religious liberty issues. A ton of legally, the doctrine that we're suing under is free speech. Right. So we've represented Christian clients, we've represented Jewish clients, we've represented people who, quite frankly, I don't know what their religious affiliation is. But again, the goal is to increase liberty and open the marketplace of ideas for students on campus. A campus should be a place where viewpoints are welcome, where disagreement and dissent is welcome. Right. But right now, often for conservative and Christian students, it is a closed marketplace.
Let me just read an excerpt out of your book, The Fire's Guide to Religious Liberty on Campus. You said no public university may restrict freedom of religion indirectly by adopting some official campus secular political orthodoxy such as multiculturalism or diversity. Let me ask you this, and here's my theory on why colleges and universities write some of these policies that end up being discriminatory against religious groups. Even if we assume for a moment that college administrators are politically and socially neutral, which many of them aren't, they are receiving legal counsel. They have their own attorneys on retainer, and they know that they're constantly under attack by external organizations of the left and the right that are trying to pressure them into forming one policy or another, or to adopt whatever set of views or push whatever agenda. So consequently, their attorneys are telling them, hey, listen, the worst thing you got to worry about is a harassment lawsuit, a discrimination lawsuit. So you have to show in a court of law that you proactively have taken steps to avert and avoid racial discrimination, and that you have tolerance and diversity and multiculturalism. So consequently, they write policies that err on the side of catering to all of that, and the conservative or the religious views be darned. And so consequently, then a group like yours steps up and says, okay, we're going to defend the student rights with respect to religion, and then we're going to write a letter to the university to get them to change the policy. And they think, well, you know what, it's better to change the policy from the ADF's letter rather than to deal with a discrimination suit, which is far more expensive and is far more damaging in the court of public opinion. Do you agree with that theory? And how do you see, or if not, what do you see as the cause?
Well, there's a lot of validity to that. What I've long said is it's the combination of ideology and bureaucracy. So on the one hand, you have the ideology that says there are historically marginalized and oppressed groups surrounding sexual orientation, race, gender, etc. And ideologically, what we're wanting to do is redress historical imbalances, end the patriarchy, end religious oppression, etc., etc. Then the bureaucracy side is exactly what you described. It's lawyers coming in, administrators coming in and saying, in essence, look, you've got to impose anti-harassment codes. You've got to impose non-discrimination codes, or you're going to leave yourself vulnerable. So you combine those two, and you have an anti-discrimination policy, which every school has to have, but they're written in such a way as they satisfy the ideological needs of the college. So they're not really actually neutral anymore. There are non-discrimination policies that are incredibly broad, that are incredibly all-consuming in their reach, and then the application of them is often quite specific to one side of the spectrum.
But they would
so
argue
the two things work together.
I'm sorry, they would argue that they get more flack from that side as opposed to from the other side. So even if they were neutral, it's just a matter of getting more pressure from one side as opposed to the other. Do you agree with that claim?
I would say that they have more internal pressure from the left without question, because the left is overrepresented on campus. So anytime you're going to have a policy discussion on campus, if 8 to 9 out of 10 of your professors are on the left, if similar numbers of your administrators are on the left, well, yeah, absolutely. The pressure. So that's why I say it's the combination of ideology and bureaucracy.
Okay.
You have to have a non-discrimination policy. You got to formulate it. You got to draft it. Who's going to be drafting it? All the people on the left that dominate the campus. Okay. So there's your combination.
All right. Well, that's actually all the time we have. Unfortunately, I'd like to talk to you about this again, David, in the future to see what new cases arise. But for now, I want to thank you, David French, for joining us today. This has been Inside Academia with yours truly, Andy Nash. Check us out again next week, as every week, on InsideAcademia.tv as we take you for a look behind the ivory curtain.